What is applied linguistics? Introduction. Applied linguistics is using what we know about language, how it is learned, and how it is used in order to achieve some purposes or solve some problems in the real world. Traditionally, the primary concern of applied linguistics has been second language acquisition theory, second language pedagogy, and the interface between the two. Carter and Noonan list the subdisciplines in which applied linguists also take an interest. The list includes literacy, speech pathology, deaf education, interpreting and translating, communication practices, lexicography, and first language acquisition. Besides mother tongue education, language planning, and bilingualism or multilingualism, two other areas that Carter and Noonan did not list are authorship identification and forensic linguistics. Authorship identification uses statistical analysis of various linguistic features in anonymous or disputed texts and compares the results with a similar analysis from texts whose authors are known. For instance, the search for the anonymous author of the 18th century political letters written under the pseudonym of Junius is an example of this. A linguistic analysis of the vocabulary in the letters, for example, whether on or upon was used, showed that it was very similar to the use of vocabulary in the writings of Sir Philip Francis, who was then identified the probable author. Similar analyses are carried out in forensic linguistics, often to establish the probability of whether or not a defendant or witness actually produced a specific piece of discourse. Crystal relates a case where a convicted murderer was pardoned partially because a linguistic analysis showed that the transcript of his oral statement written by the police was very different stylistically from his normal speech patterns. This discrepancy cast strong doubts on the accuracy of the incriminating evidence in the transcript. In addition to all these areas and purposes, applied linguistics is interested in cases where language goes wrong. Researchers working on language related disorders study the speech of aphasic, schizophrenic, and autistic speakers, as well as hemispherectomy patients, in the belief that we can better understand how the brain functions when we analyze what happens when the speaker's language system breaks down or doesn't function properly. Even slips of the tongue and ear committed by normal individuals can give us insights into how the human brain processes language. Applied linguistics in the 20th century. The real acceleration of change in linguistic description and pedagogy occurred during the 20th century. At the beginning of the century, second languages were usually taught by the grammar translation method, which had been in use since the late 18th century, but was fully codified in the 19th century by Karl Plotz. A lesson would typically have one or two new grammar rules, a list of vocabulary items, and some practice examples to translate from first language L1 into second language L2, or vice versa. The method grew into a very controlled system with a heavy emphasis on accuracy and explicit grammar rules, many of which were quite obscure. One of the main problems with grammar translation was that it focused on the ability to analyze language and not the ability to use it. In addition, the emphasis on reading and writing did little to promote an ability to communicate orally in the target language. Emergence of the direct method. By the beginning of the 20th century, new use based ideas had coalesced into what became known as the direct method. This emphasized exposure to oral language with listening and speaking as the primary skills. Meaning was related directly to the target language without the step of translation, while explicit grammar teaching was also downplayed. It imitated how a mother tongue is learned naturally, with listening first, then speaking, and only later reading and writing. The focus was squarely on use of the second language with the stronger proponents banishing all use of the L1 in the classroom. The direct method had its own problems, however. It required teachers to be highly proficient in the target language, which was not always possible. Also, it mimicked L1 learning but didn't take into account the differences between L1 and L2 acquisition. One key difference is that L1 learners have abundant exposure to the target language, which the direct method could not hope to match. Vocabulary control and the reading method. In the UK, Michael West was interested in increasing learners' exposure to language through reading. His reading method attempted to make this possible by promoting reading skills through vocabulary management. This focus on vocabulary management was part of a greater approach called the vocabulary control movement, which eventually resulted in a book called The General Service List of English Words in 1953, which listed the most useful 2,000 words in English. Mid-century, audiolingual, and army method. The three methods, grammar translation, the direct method, and the reading method, continued to hold sway until World War II. During the war, the weaknesses of all of the above approaches became obvious as the American military found itself short of people who were conversationally fluent in foreign languages. It needed a way of training soldiers in oral skills quickly. American structural linguists stepped into the gap and developed a program which borrowed from the direct method, especially its emphasis on listening and speaking. It drew its rationale from the dominant psychological theory of the time, behaviorism, that essentially said that language learning was a result of habit formation. Thus, the method included activities which were believed to reinforce good language habits such as close attention to pronunciation, intensive oral drilling, a focus on sentence patterns, and memorization. In short, students were expected to learn through drills rather than through an analysis of the target language. The students who went through this army method were mostly mature and highly motivated, and their success was dramatic. This success meant that the method naturally continued on after the war, and it came to be known as audiolingualism. Chomsky's revolution in linguistics. Chomsky's attack on the behaviorist underpinnings of structural linguistics in the late 1950s proved decisive, and it's associated pedagogical approach. Audiolingualism began to fall out of favor, supplanting the behaviorist idea of habit formation. Language was now seen as governed by cognitive factors, in particular, a set of abstract rules which were assumed to be innate. Chomsky suggested that children form hypotheses about their language that they tested out in practice. Some would naturally be incorrect, but Chomsky and his followers argued that children don't receive enough negative feedback from other people about these inappropriate language forms, negative evidence, to be able to discard them. Thus, some other mechanism must constrain the type of hypothesis generated. Chomsky posited that children are born with an understanding of the way languages work, which was referred to as universal grammar. They would know the underlying principles of language. For example, languages usually have pronouns and their parameters. Some languages allow these pronouns to be dropped when in the subject position. Thus, children would need only enough exposure to a language to determine whether their L1 allowed the deletion of pronouns like Japanese or not, like English. Shift to communicative competence. In the early 1970s, Hymes added the concept of communicative competence, which emphasized that language competence consists of more than just being able to form grammatically correct sentences, but also to know when and where to use these sentences and to whom. At the same time, Halliday's systematic functional grammar was offering an alternative to Chomsky's approach in 1973, in which language was seen not as something exclusively internal to a learner, but rather as a means of functioning in society. Krashen's monitor theory and communicative language teaching. In the early 1980s, a theory of acquisition promoted by Krashen focused attention on the role of input. Krashen's monitor theory posited that a second language was mainly unconsciously acquired through exposure to comprehensible input rather than being learned through explicit exercises, that it required a focus on meaning rather than form, and that a learner's emotional state can affect this acquisition effective filter. The pedagogical implications of this theory were that classrooms should supply a rich source of language exposure that was meaning based and understandable, always including some elements just beyond the current level of learner's ability. The methodology which developed from these factors emphasized the use of language for meaningful communication, communicative language teaching, CLT. The focus was on learners' message and fluency rather than their grammatical accuracy. It was often taught through problem solving activities and tasks which required students to transact information, such as information gap exercises. In this, one student is given information the other doesn't have, with the two having to negotiate the exchange of that information. Taken further, students could be taught some non-language related subject such as history or politics in the L2. The assumption was that the learners would acquire the L2 simply by using it to learn the subject matter contents, without the L2 being the focus of explicit instruction. Taking the communicative approach to its logical extreme, students could be enrolled in immersion programs. Results from this kind of immersion programs showed that learners could indeed become quite fluent in an L2 through exposure without explicit instruction, and that they developed excellent receptive skills. However, they also showed that the learners continued to make certain persistent grammatical errors even after many years of instruction. It seems as if a certain amount of explicit instruction focusing on language form may be necessary as well. Incorporating social and cultural elements into applied linguistics. Leboeuf began exploring how social factors influence L1 language use in 1970, and Terran and others later did the same for L2 usage in 1979. The study of the interface of social factors and language use eventually developed into the field of sociolinguistics. Similarly, it was acknowledged that the context in which language is used, for example, for what purpose, the relative power relationship between interlocutors, also affects the language of communication. The study of these factors blossomed in the area of pragmatics. Psycholinguistic perspectives in applied linguistics. One of the most noticeable recent trends has been the establishment of a more psychological perspective of language acquisition, processing, and use. Psycholinguistic perspectives have now become a major influence in applied linguistics in areas ranging from theory building to research methodology. Perhaps the most noticeable outcome is that the current leading theories of how second languages are acquired are all informed by psycholinguistic thinking and research. Although these theories differ somewhat, at heart most of them maintain that the mind extracts the recurring patterns from the language input a learner receives. These patterns exist with the smallest components of language all the way up to overall connected discourse. Current thinking is that the human mind is very good at extracting these patterns and using them to build up a picture of systematicity of a language. In a sense, the learner's linguistic knowledge is constructed through general learning mechanism rather than being innately in place, as Chomsky posited more than half a century earlier. The process is implicit, but eventually the patterns may become salient enough that a learner is able to describe them explicitly. Newer psycholinguistic techniques can look into the inner workings of the brain while learners are using language in various ways. This allows exploration of linguistic knowledge even before learners become aware of it. Language is immensely complex and numerous factors affect how it is learned. While past research has often considered how these factors work in combination to lead to the end product of learning, there is a growing awareness that the various factors also affect each other in dynamic and fluid ways. For example, language learners' willingness to communicate WTC is partially dependent on their levels of proficiency and on their linguistic self confidence. However, while the two factors exert their effect on WTC, they themselves can also change. For example, successful communication can improve the learner's language proficiency and enhance their confidence. In addition, it is easy to see how the two factors can affect each other. Greater proficiency should lead to greater confidence. Conversely, greater confidence may lead to the learners putting themselves in situations where they use and practice the language more, which in turn may lead to improved proficiency. We move from discrete to more holistic and integrative. Up until the middle of the last century, language was viewed in very discrete terms. It was made up of grammar, phonology, and vocabulary, each of which could be separately identified and described. In fact, phonetics was the first area within linguistics to become well developed late 19th century, and the reform movement in language teaching led by phoneticians was very influential in encouraging a focus on the spoken language. The last 40 years have seen a move towards viewing language in much more integrative and holistic terms. We now know that language use is not just a product of a number of individual languages, knowledge bits, which reside completely within interlocutors, language users. It is also profoundly affected by a number of other factors, such as the social context, who you are communicating with, and for what purpose, the degree of involvement and interaction, the mood of communication, written versus spoken, and time constraints. Lexical grammar and formulaic language. The areas of vocabulary and grammar provide a good example of this new integrative approach. Traditionally, vocabulary was viewed as individual words which could be taught and used in isolation. With grammar being highlighted in most theories and pedagogical methodologies, vocabulary items were seen merely as slot fillers necessary to fill out syntactic structures. This conception saw vocabulary and grammar as two discrete entities which could be taught and learned separately. This view is starting to change, and one of the most interesting developments in applied linguistics today is the realization that vocabulary and grammar are not necessarily separate things, but may be viewed as two elements of a single language system referred to as lexicogrammar. Bringing the language learner into the discussion. Previously, much of the discussion about language learning focused on the best techniques and materials for teaching. In other words, it had a focus on the teacher. There seemed to be an unexpressed view that the learner was somehow a container into which language knowledge could be poured. This view fitted well with teacher fronted classes and behaviorist theories, which suggested learning was merely the result of practice and conditioning. However, in the early 1970s, it was realized that the learners are active participants in the learning process and should be allowed to take substantial responsibility for their own learning. This led to interest in the various ways in which individual learners were different from one another and how that might affect their learning. It was eventually discovered that the correspondence between a strategy training and use and higher language achievement was less direct than previously assumed. It is clear that effective strategy use can facilitate language learning, but it is still unclear how to best train learners to use strategies, or indeed how effective a strategy training is in general. More recently, there has been a great deal of emphasis on how the individual characteristics of each learner affects their learning, that is, individual differences. Clearly, a range of differences either constrain or facilitate the rate at which second languages are learned, including age, aptitude, learning style preferences, strategy use, and motivation. New perspectives on teaching the four skills. The teaching of the four language skills has long been an important concern in second language pedagogy. Language use inevitably involves one or more of the four skills. Furthermore, each skill may usefully be described in terms of the top down and bottom up processing required. Listeners and readers work to decode and construct meanings and messages, whereas speakers and writers use language resources to encode and express meanings and messages. These meanings and messages occur at the level of text or discourse. Thus, discourse analysis is highly relevant to understanding the four skills. Top down processing utilizes shared knowledge, pragmatic knowledge, and contextual information to achieve an appropriate interpretation or realization of textual meanings and messages. Bottom up processing depends on language resources, lexicogrammar and phonology pronunciation, or orthography as aids to the accurate decoding or interpretation or encoding or realization of meaningful text. Typically, more than one language skill is involved in any communicative activity. For example, we take turns at listening and speaking in conversation. We write notes while listening to a lecture. We read a passage carefully in order to write a summary, etc. The lack of black and white answers. Because language is created and processed both between interlocutors and within the human mind, much of what is of interest in applied linguistics is hidden from direct view and study. Despite the advances in psycholinguistic methodologies, we cannot yet look into the human brain and directly observe language, which means that the most research has to rely on indirect evidence observable through language processing and use. The results of such indirect evidence need to be interpreted, and usually more than one interpretation is possible. This makes it difficult to say much with complete certainty about language learning and